Before I continue to make Malcolm Bowden my bitch, I would like to talk about a couple of frequent comments that were made in response to the first part of this series. Many of you asked me exactly what the ether is, and I apologise for failing to address this the first time round. It's important because essentially Malcolm Bowden's arguments rely on just assuming that the ether exists and then bastardising legitimate scientific experiments in order to somehow justify geocentrism. By the end of the 19th century, a lot of work in wave mechanics had already been done, and physicists were beginning to think about the nature of light and how light propagates. Now, they assumed that light required a medium to transmit through, rather like sound, and so they assumed that a medium existed and they called it the ether. Fairly quickly, this concept ran into some serious problems, perhaps most notably the speed of light. If light travels at a constant velocity through the ether, then presumably if an observer also travels at a velocity through the ether, the velocity of light will appear to change from that observer's perspective. Well, this disagrees with experiment, and as Richard Feynman would have said, it's wrong. It turns out that no matter how fast you go, light always appears to travel at the same speed from your perspective. So the scientists of the day thought that perhaps the ether dragged and was carried with the observer. Well, this would have solved the problem, but in experiment it produced a string of null results. The idea simply did not agree with observation. It wouldn't be until the early 20th century when the brilliant physicist Albert Einstein turned his attention to the propagation of light that the problem would be solved.
And there's no such thing as the ether. If it existed, light would be slowed down by it, and it isn't. Light always travels at the same speed. There's no such thing as the ether.
Einstein had been working on his theory of relativity, and one of his assumptions was the principle of relativity, that the laws of physics are the same for all freely moving observers, and the speed of light in vacuo is a law of physics. He developed a solution for the propagation of light, not in terms of photons, particles, or waves, but much more elegantly as a fundamental property of the geometry of space-time. And everything fell into place. In a way, we might call Einstein the Darwin of light, because, if you'll pardon the expression, nothing makes sense except in the light of relativity. Einstein's new theory was able to account for every single null result from the ether experiments, but it did not require the existence of the ether at all. And this brings us to where we are today, with the ether being no doubt a very important part of the history of physics, but nevertheless a superseded hypothesis. The ether is a dead horse, and Malcolm Bowden is a little child with a cricket bat, a lot of angst, and far too much time on his hands. The other frequent comment that I received was that making videos debunking geocentrists seemed like a waste of time. Well, aside from wanting these videos to be at least a little bit informative and entertaining, there is a very serious point that I intend to make about the differences between critical thinking and every other type of thinking. Hopefully it will begin to become clear in this part of the series, so please bear with it. Now it's time to put on your goggles, so you don't get stupid in your eyes.
In 1871, Airy, who was the Astronomer Royal, carried out an experiment to see whether we were moving through the ether and the starlight coming down the telescopes was stationary and it was we who were doing the moving, or whether perhaps we were on a stationary Earth and it was the starlight passing across us that was producing what is known as Bradley's experiment.
Right, except that's absolute bullshit, because that's not what Airy sought to test at all. I think you'd find it extremely edifying to read the papers, Malcolm. You know, the papers that you cite at the end of your videos. You know, the ones that you write silly little comments underneath. Yeah, I'll get to those in a minute. See, unlike you, Malcolm, Airy understood astrophysics very well, and he didn't dispute the motion of the Earth. He makes it abundantly clear in the paper that he set out to rigorously repeat an experiment that was first performed by a German astronomer, one Professor Ernst Klinkerfues, in an attempt to validate or falsify his hypothesis, which predicted an apparent alteration in stellar aberration when light is passed through a telescope with a significantly large objective glass, or in Airy's case, a tube full of water. So what exactly does this have to do with the ether? Well, Klinkerfuse's hypothesis was developed within the framework of the undulatory light theory, and this required the existence of an ether. But the ether was already in trouble at this point because, if you recall, ether drag had to be invoked to explain why the speed of light was constant. But if the ether drag hypothesis were correct, no stellar aberration should be detected at all, and yet by this point it was an established physical law. Nevertheless, concessions were still being made, and both Klinkerfuse and Airy were fascinated in whether or not the translational motion of a medium would have any effect on the aberration of stars. If Airy failed to measure the predicted value, that would render Klinkerfuse's hypothesis incorrect.
Airy filled the telescope with water and compared it with previous measurements of the same star, and he did not have to tip that telescope any further than in the previous set of readings when the telescope was without water. And that showed very clearly that it was not the telescope that was moving, but the starlight and the ether was moving relative to a stationary telescope.
No, that did not show very clearly anything about the motion of the telescope or the starlight.
And the interesting thing is that if you read his report, it is very short, and there is not a single mention of the significance of that experiment. It is purely talking about the various accuracies of the experiment that he made. Nothing about the amazing conclusion that comes from Airy's failure.
Why is it that only geocentrists refer to this as Airy's failure? Kind of telling, don't you think? Like they want to repaint history? And how can it be Airy's failure anyway? I mean, if anything, it's Klinkerfuse's hypothesis that's being falsified here by Airy with a very accurate and rigorous experiment. And regardless of whether this is anyone's failure, it's certainly a success for scientific progress, because these kinds of experiments did so much to chisel away at the redundant assumption of the existence of the luminiferous ether. Now, about that amazing conclusion that was supposedly missing from his paper, well, Malcolm, if you actually read the paper carefully, you'd probably find it right here. Let me quote it to you. Remarking that the mean results for geographical latitude of the instrument agree within a fraction of a second, I think myself justified in concluding that the hypothesis of Professor Klinkerfuse is untenable. Okay, not quite the conclusion you want, is it? But then again, that's not surprising, because the conclusion you want is completely stupid. Wait a minute, hang on. The ether is moving? Is that what you think? You think that the ether is moving, so it exists and it is moving. But ether drag, or the stationary ether at the level of the experiment, is what's required to actually save the ether hypothesis, because, remember, the speed of light is constant for all observers. If the ether was moving, this simply wouldn't be the case, Malcolm. So which is it? Does the ether rotate freely about the Earth in contradiction to experiment? Or does the ether drag in contradiction to experiment? I think you'll find that the third option, the ether does not exist, is actually the correct answer. But this just isn't good enough for Malcolm Bowden, is it? Because he believes that the ether is there, and so it must be. This is a perfect example of the kind of unreliable, non-critical thinking that geocentrists such as redsky, and indeed all creationists, indulge themselves in so frequently. They are so willing to hijack anything that looks even remotely scientific, which might apparently support their position, even if it flatly contradicts one of the other fundamental tenets of their argument, and no matter how dubious the source may be. I find it simply staggering that someone like Malcolm would go out onto the internet, a public forum, and just demonstrate how much of an incompetent buffoon he is. Well, unfortunately for him, there will always be others out here who can see through the bollocks that he's talking, and will always be ready to defend the well of knowledge. In the next video, we'll see Malcolm trot out a real gem in the form of the Michelson-Gale experiment, and we'll witness him pushing his own doublethink to a new and previously unprecedented level. However, before I wrap up this video, I'd like to bring your attention to a paper that I recommend for anyone who's interested in the history of Airy's Water Telescope. It was published by H.P. Hollis, and for your convenience, I've retrieved the appropriate pages in PDF form from ADS and uploaded it to my own website. The link is in the sidebar. Until next time, clear skies and good debunking.
Malcolm Bowden is also on wheels, so it can move about.